So one of the things that I'm as certain as I can be, I try not to be certain on anything, but as close to certainty as I can be, is that more input is always better. More information is always better, assuming you're evaluating it and assessing it properly, right? You never want to blindly just take in information. You never want to just kind of hear something and just say, oh, well, that must be the truth, so I'm going to go with it. You know, if you're taking in information and you're active in your awareness of it and thinking through it rationally and objectively, trying to remove emotion from it, and really the math that I always talk about, doing all your calculations and your math as you're assessing this thing in the right way, you should never be afraid of more input. You should never be worried to hear somebody's thoughts on something, right? If I believe racism is a huge issue in the country and we need to fix it, if somebody comes to me and says, hey, listen, let me tell you why racism isn't an issue, from a very logical perspective, my response to that should be like, oh, wow, awesome. Like, there's a chance that racism isn't an issue? That's great. Let me hear what you got. Like, tell me. Let's test it out. Let's see if it's true. And then I'll go through my process of assessing it, right? And I'll make a determination. So it almost seems silly that, you would get angry at somebody like that. You may disagree with the premise, right, ultimately of what they say or whatever their point is. But if they're just bringing information, there's no reason to be angry or afraid of that. Take it in, assess it, objectively determine, and move on. And I feel, again, relatively strongly about that. Again, if you could do it the right way. But I find that at odds with what I hear a lot of people talk about often, right? Social media, articles, different things. And the mindset of not wanting to hear certain speech, right? You'll hear it, I don't know how fair this is, but typically you hear it more of the left, right? Of liberals who don't want certain speakers coming to college campuses. They don't want to hear from certain people whose views are perhaps racist or bigoted or sexist or whatever it might be. And the fear, as I understand it, is, you can't give that a platform. And what you often hear in response from many times liberals, but often conservatives as well, is like, what's the logic there, right? Why are you afraid of thoughts? You don't have to adopt it, right? Very much like I'm saying. You don't, as long as you assess it properly, it shouldn't scare you. You could disagree with everything the person has to say, but who cares? Just because they said it, like, what are you actually afraid of? So when you start to play that out, as I've been trying to do, I'm trying to figure it out, right? I'm trying to make the case for the other side, because there's too many people that seem to believe it for me to just dismiss it and say it's nonsense, it's an irrational thinking. And as I think through that, there's a couple, I guess, rational reasons why somebody might say they fear speak, right? They fear somebody speaking and the things they might say. The two that come to mind right away are the potential rational explanations. Is one, you don't trust in the mass population that they're able to decipher and do that assessment that we talked about, right? That I talked about. As long as you would take in these inputs in the right way, there's nothing to be afraid of. I would imagine there's some fear of people that, for themselves or again for the mass population, that we're not particularly good at that. So if these people do speak and we give them a platform, there's a chance that the people that hear it are going to be influenced by it and perhaps adopt that view, which honestly is not a crazy thought. I mean, I don't think it's irrational. I would generally agree with that it's a really difficult thing to be self-aware and super rational in your thinking. So it's probably valid in spirit. It gets tricky in terms of who's to say that, who makes that determination. And is that even all right to say, well, I don't think you'll think about it right, so let me save you from yourself. It quickly gets into a kind of a moral dilemma that's difficult. The second reason, which maybe is the more compelling one because of the issues just stated with the first one, the second reason why I think somebody would want to shut down somebody who's speaking, right? Shut down that type of thing, is that they've seen over time, right, as they look through history, that that severe action needs to be taken, right? So let's take it in the case of like racism. If you're somebody that believes racism is systemic and deep-rooted in the country and in our institutions, it got there for a reason. It got there probably deliberately or intentionally. And the view that, some people think racism's not real or whatever the case may be, and they're going to speak on it. I could see somebody having a fear of this is just status quo, right? They're telling us it's freedom of speech, but this type of freedom of speech has led to centuries and centuries of oppression of people based on their race. So I guess ultimately what they're saying is that speech is dangerous, right? The theory in the First Amendment is that freedom of speech, right? Speech can't hurt you. Exactly what I said in the beginning. As long as you're taking in more the inputs the right way and assessing it, there's no harm to be done there. But I think what somebody in this situation would say is, well, that's not true. That's faulty logic, right? Speech can very much, in fact, hurt people. And I would imagine they believe it's been proven over time that by allowing these types of thoughts to exist and flourish and fester and have a platform and continue to have them be shared and not shot down and called out, you're enabling the system to continue. So it's not out of ignorance. It's not out of irrationality. It's not out of distrust of their fellow man or just this belief that they can't handle it, kind of like the first reason got to. It's a very rational belief that it's the only way to actually solve the problem. We have to shut these things down. There's too much power in the system, right? Again, this being the belief that there's too much power in the system for people that have these thoughts, these racist thoughts, whatever it might be, that make our institutions racist. You have to take that power away. So, again, it's just my theory on what they might think, what they might believe. So what I like to go from there then is, well, what would my counter to that be? Do I take that in and say, interesting. I guess I get that. Maybe we should shut down speech. Or is there a counter to it, right? My gut reaction is to say, I hear that. I hear what you're saying. Probably my biggest response is, let's assume it's true. Let's assume speech does hurt people in that way, and that's why you need to shut it down. The problem becomes you still get to a moral dilemma like you did in the first situation, which is who's determining which speech we shut down? Who's determining that type of speech, that particular type of racist talk is in fact racist and it's dangerous, right? Because once you start, and this is the whole point of the First Amendment, once you start censoring speech, it becomes a subjective exercise and it becomes a very slippery slope where everything becomes on the table for potentially being censored. So I say that, in this hypothetical discussion I'm having with myself, to the belief that speech is in fact dangerous and that's why we need to shut it down. What's the second, third, fourth level of that? Let's assume you achieve your objective. Let's assume you shut down all of that speech. How do you prevent it from becoming a new issue, right? How do you prevent it from a new problem that would pop up? Maybe your answer is that problem is one you'd rather deal with. It's not as bad as racism. Maybe you haven't thought that far and it's something that now, is worth thinking through. Or maybe there's some other explanation to it. But the reason I like to kind of go through these little thought exercises in my head of things that I feel pretty certain about is it's usually the things that help drive the conversation. It doesn't solve it yet, but you start getting, just keep pushing it to the next level. Okay, let's assume that's true. Let's go to the next piece. What happens then? Let's assume you think this, right? Okay, let's go with that and let's act as if that's right. Where does it go from there? Because, oftentimes I think it's not necessarily a short-sighted view, but it's shorter-sighted than it should be, right? You have to look at these things and look how they play out third, fourth, fifth, sixth level before you make decisions like this. And I think sometimes people are too quick to make a more short-sighted decision, not think that much further. And it's based in something that they believe to be true and might be right? Racism is bad. We need to stop racist speak because we think that's the way to actually end racism in the country. That may all be true, but you still have to entertain the idea of what else comes with that, right? Is there a better way to end it? Maybe that's one way, but there's a better way. Or if there's not, is there certain things you could do to mitigate it, right? The potential problems that come along with it, rather than just kind of a blunt tool instrument to say, shut down the speech. All things that I think are valuable to consider and maybe help towards the objective that much more.